Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the SKIP virtual event series, and my name is Michelle Winter. I am the Director of Education Programming here at SKIP, and I'll be moderating the program today. Our program is entitled How to Use Competitive Intelligence to Retain More Customers. Just want to go through some simple housekeeping just to make sure everything in your experience will be maximized today during the program. This is a live webinar. Your computer will show the presentation and stream the live audio, so please make sure that your computer audio is on. All participants will be muted during the duration of the program. There is a Q&A function that will be active during the presentation that enables you to type in your questions for me, the moderator, and we will answer and ask questions as we go along, so please feel free to be involved and make this a more interactive experience. And lastly, we don't foresee technical issues. However, sometimes internet programs are subject to them. And should this happen, we will contact you regarding rescheduling. Our program today will be presented by Ellie Merman, the CMO of Crayon. And with that, I turn it over to you, Ellie.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. So great to be on the call today to talk about a pretty exciting subject in my mind, how to use competitive intelligence to retain more customers. Excited to talk about this for this session, partially because we got to talk about it at the SKIP conference in this past year. You know, there's only so much you can cover during one session at a conference, so we get to go a lot more in depth today. Provide a lot of hopefully very actionable playbooks for you to actually use competitive intelligence for customer retention. So let's dive in. Before we get into the content of the webinar, we're speaking at a very timely moment because Forrester just released a new wave on market and competitive intelligence platforms just yesterday. This is actually their first evaluation of the space. We were lucky to be called a leader in the report, and we've licensed the report. So if anyone is interested in downloading it and seeing all of the results, you can go to crayon.co/wave. It's a complimentary copy for you, available on our site. All right, well, let's talk about using CI for retention. So here's our agenda for the call. We'll kick things off with just some definitions, setting the stage of what is retention, what is churn, especially if those are some newer terms for some of the folks on the call. Then we'll talk about understanding and analyzing churn and what goes into that. And then talk about using CI to proactively reduce churn or proactively increase retention. We'll talk a little bit about the dynamics there. And then finally talk about integrating all of these lessons back into the business to make sure that we're seeing the full impact of our CI efforts in this area and that we're closing the loop to make sure that we're having the impact that we'd like. All right, so kicking things off, what is retention and what is churn? So the title of the webinar is all about customer retention, so let's start there. So retention is the percentage of customers that renew or purchase from you again. Think about those repeat, long-lasting customers. And so when we want to calculate what our retention rate is, we're looking at how many customers have renewed with us divided by our total customers. Pretty simple calculation there, simple formula, but this is what's going to tell us how healthy is our business in terms of keeping the customers that we've already won. But you saw I integrated the word churn in a lot of places throughout the presentation. So let's define that. Churn is really just the opposite. It's the perhaps more negative way of looking at retention. It's the customer turnover, the customers that we have lost. So here we have the percentage of customers that leave our service. That's our churn rate. And so to calculate that, we're looking at the customers that we've lost divided by our total customers. And that tells us perhaps how unhealthy our business is. Hopefully it's a nice low number. And we're going to talk about how we can keep that number nice and low. Now, why are we even talking about this? Why is this such a hot topic? Well, it's because churn has a really meaningful impact on our business as a whole, and it really impacts every single part of the business. Certainly, it impacts our financials. It has, a very meaningful impact on our bottom line, a very meaningful negative impact because we're losing those customers, we're losing that revenue. It also inhibits our growth because honestly, we're spending so much resource, so much time, so much money to try to retain these customers that if we have this risk of a lot of customers leaving our solution, we end up wasting a lot of resources just trying to keep them, trying to save them, trying to fix problems, and that means that we have resources that are being kept away from other things that we could be doing. So we're really holding ourselves back if we're not addressing this issue. Certainly, it can have a more emotional impact as well on the company, more of a culture impact, because the more customers we lose, the more negative feedback we hear, and it just kind of drags down everyone in the company, which in turn translates into lower energy in the office and less of a drive of all of the employees, and even struggling to retain some of our employees in the business as well. And then finally, of course, our reputation. The more customers we lose, the more negative feedback there is out in the market. So it's actually going to make it more difficult for us to continue to grow because these customers who have had a poor experience are damaging our reputation. We're really damaging our own reputation by not serving them well. And then again, this churn challenge affects all parts of the organization. Certainly executive leadership cares about all the things we just talked about, especially the financials. Of course, the finance team cares about that as well. The sales team, the less success we're having with our customers, the more difficult it is to sign on new customers, say account management in there as well, trying to retain and upsell those customers. The marketing team, there's so much around the reputation that we're building that customer success, when done well, can actually be a huge boost to marketing. But when it's more of a weakness of the organization, that really hurts the marketing department. Of course, product development, if customers are having a poor experience with the product itself, it's definitely going to affect that team. And then again, the client service team probably bearing the brunt of the initial impact and playing a key role throughout this process. So let's just talk about a couple of churn facts from our friends from Anova Consulting. So it is pretty well known that it is far more expensive to acquire new customers than to retain existing ones. In some articles say 7, some articles say 5, but clearly much more expensive to acquire net new customers than to retain our existing customers. So that much more important if we want to maintain that revenue, we want to maintain that positive customer success. So much easier to focus our efforts on existing customers. On average, 11 months of revenue to break even on a SaaS customer acquisition. So for those of us in SaaS or really any product that depends on renewals, we're putting a lot of effort, a lot of resources into getting that initial customer that we actually lose money on them when we first sign them on. And we need to have them stay on as a customer long-term to even start to see some sort of break-even point and then profit on that specific account. So it's so important for us to be able to retain those customers because honestly, otherwise we're losing money every day. And then really unfortunate statistic here that 25% of customers that depart had no intention of doing so. So there are so many customers that are churning, that are not renewing, that actually would have loved to stay on board and keep on that long-term relationship with your organization. And so clearly something went wrong. And our goal right now is to figure out, hey, how do we stay on top of that and prevent those situations, rectify any issues so that we can actually save those 25% and even more to make sure that we have a nice and healthy business. Now, churn varies a lot. So there are a bunch of great benchmarks from Recurly on this article of theirs. And there are a couple, different ways to cut the averages, but certainly there are wide variances across different industries. You see, anything from say 5% to 10% typical churn rates, but clearly you can see it's a very different situation in different industries, and within different industries, there's a wide range. I think what's most important when you're thinking about the churn for your business is to yes, do a little bit of benchmarking, but more look at the trends over time for your own business. And we'll talk more about doing that calculation and looking at those trends. But definitely check out some of these benchmarks. It's really varies a lot. One of the interesting takeaways that I found from their site was that churn is actually much higher in B2C industries than B2B. 7% versus 5%. So great benchmarks there, but then start to do your own internal benchmarks and track that over time. All right, well, let's get into some of the meat of all that calculation, understanding and analyzing churn. So there are a couple of different ways that you can go about churn analysis. There's the quantitative side and there's the qualitative side, and you really need both pieces to get the full picture. So on the quantitative side, that's calculating your churn rate. And that's the calculation we talked about before. Really helps you kind of put into context and give you some benchmarks internally to track over time. And then there's the qualitative side. I'm calling them churn debriefs, but essentially they are interviews and surveys and really talking to customers who have churned or considered it to get more of the why behind the numbers. So let's talk about each of these. On the quantitative side, a couple of tips here. First off, get into a regular cadence of tracking your churn rate. So, here at Crayon, we track our churn monthly, which helps us, make sure that we're on top of any sort of shifts in our customer base. But then, of course, you're also looking for those longer-term trends. So tracking monthly or some sort of short cadence gives you enough data points to start to see trends as quickly as possible. One of the challenges that you have with churn is it's a bit of a lagging indicator of all of the other things happening with the business. So you really want to jump on the trend as soon as you can find it. And then you want to augment the data, right? It's not just about the number of customers that have been lost and the number that have been retained. It's also about why. So this will definitely vary by business, but we have different reason codes. So for every any customer, if they do churn, you can mark off, well, what were the key reasons? And you can have multiple reasons. You can have a primary reason, you can have a set of reasons, but the goal here is to start to find those trends behind the numbers. And so categorizing the churns as best as possible can help surface that. And then you can also, so you can slice and dice by the reason codes, but you can also slice and dice by a lot of different other criteria to help hone in on, are there particular customer segments where we're struggling more or less? And so that might be the industry, that might be the size of the business, that might be the use case or the product line, a lot of different ways that are very specific to your business. And then ultimately we're trying to find those issues, right? Diagnose the issue and then set an action plan. Now on the qualitative side, there are a lot of different sources and pros and cons to each of these approaches to doing the qualitative analysis. So you can either do this in-house or you can hire a third-party organization to do these interviews for you. If you do it in-house, the downside is that it's definitely more manual. It definitely takes internal resources to do that. There can be lower response rates because it's tied to your organization rather than being a third party. On the plus side, you do have that industry knowledge, so you might be able to dig deeper on certain questions to really get at the core of what's going on in a particular account. And I mean, it's somewhat free. It doesn't cost any additional dollars, but of course it does require your time, which is a notable resource. If you do hire a third party, one of the great things is that they're unbiased, right? You might be coming into these interviews with your preconceived notions about this account and your product and how yours is so superior to the other solutions on the market. You, again, might have biases about the competitors that perhaps they have chosen instead. The third party comes in clean. And so they can help surface issues that maybe the organization wouldn't otherwise be willing to see. Of course, they also are skilled in exactly doing this type of research. And so they have those deep interview skills. We don't have that, that skill set in-house. The downside is it's just very costly. Really, just to get a few interviews is a pretty significant financial investment. So if you have the budget, it's a great, great way to get that insight. But otherwise, you might want to start with in-house or at least do a combination. And then there's also kind of just different approaches of gathering that data. I've mostly talked about interviews because interviews are really fantastic for surfacing that qualitative data. They can go so in depth in a way that you really can't get in any other research method. And then you surface things that you wouldn't otherwise expect, right? Because you're following up, you're sharing follow-up questions based on answers, and you can go down paths that you wouldn't have otherwise expected, and really get some unexpected answers or answers to unexpected questions. The challenge with interviews is that it's a big lift. It's a big resource commitment to make it happen. A lot of great insight, but it's a big commitment. And then what I often suggest is to do a set of interviews on a small set of customers. But then if you have certain theories about particular issues that you have, say on the product side or the service side or the sales side, you can combine that with some surveys. And so surveys can help validate with some quick statistical certainty around validating your hypotheses about some potential issues. So that's really the benefit. It's quick, you get some actual statistics, but of course you're missing that depth of insight. But if you combine interviews and surveys, you can kind of get the best of both worlds. All right. So if you are doing these interviews yourself, what's most important is to make sure to dig beyond the surface level answer. And so these are just a few sample questions. Why did your organization begin considering a change? Right? It's not just why did you make the change? It's also why did you even think about making a change? Like, walk me through that process. Did you ever provide any formal or informal warning signs? If yes, how are they responded to? Right? It's again not just about the fact that they churned. It's about what happened along the way that led them there. It's not a wake up one day and you've made that decision. There must have been many many signals and many kind of strikes against their customer experience that led them there. What specific actions could we have taken to prevent your departure? How does the experience with your new provider compare to your previous relationship? So we're starting to see a little bit of the hints of the CI element here. And would you consider partnering with us again in the future? Right, so really trying to dig beyond the surface level, ask follow-up questions as well based on the answers that you get. That's where a lot of the great insight comes. And then when it comes to analyzing the responses, right, you're going to have so much great raw feedback from these interviews. What's really key is to, again, dig deep and then dig even deeper, because so for example, with this question of what are the reasons you ultimately decided to leave, you want to understand, what were the triggers? What happened when they first considered leaving? And then start to uncover what were the actual issues, like what were the problem areas within that customer relationship. But then again, right, there are multiple strikes that ultimately lead to a breaking point. So what was that breaking point? What was the ultimate deciding reason? What was it that happened when they decided, all right, enough is enough? And then, of course, what happened after the fact? Where did they end up, giving their business? What other solutions did they consider? How did they end up choosing the particular provider, and why? And then, of course, what we're trying to do is drive some sort of action. We've uncovered so much great insight through this of understanding the issues, understanding all the warning signs, but then we want to do something about it. So what could we have done in that particular situation? and then what do we want to do as a result. And so this type of analysis can detect a whole host of different types of issues. They can, of course, surface sales issues, perhaps not setting the right expectations up front, service issues, maybe they didn't have the right level of support or onboarding, or product issues. The product just didn't serve their needs. So, be on the lookout for all of these different types of issues. And of course, it can be a combination of all of them. But then once you identify the issues, it's most important to establish an action plan. You want to actually be able to do something about the issues that you've uncovered. Now, what we've talked about so far is analyzing churn, analyzing those customers that have already decided to leave, and then trying to understand what happened, what went wrong. You can get a lot of insight and drive a lot of action out of this. The only issue is that this is a reactive response, right? Those customers are already gone. And they've already gone to another provider, or they've already canceled, and you've already hurt that relationship. So in addition to, it's very important to still have this reactive response, but it's even more important to be proactive and prevent it in the first place. And so that's where CI comes in. So let's talk about using CI to reduce churn proactively. Because this is, proactively reducing churn is where competitive intelligence plays a key role. Because, as it turns out, 90% of churned customers go to a competitor. So it was painful enough that your customers were already canceling and leaving, but that much more painful when they choose to go to a competitor. And the reality is that competitors are constantly selling to your customer base. Imagine, when a customer comes to you and they're asking about specific product capabilities or service offerings, it's not just because they're interested in that. It's likely that they've seen it elsewhere. It resonated with them, a particular functionality that a competitor has, the competitor's marketing to them, trying to sell into them, but it resonated with them. They have some sort of need around this. So it's so critical to understand the competition, how you stack up, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and where they're going. And then you can use CI in renewal conversations, in upsell conversations, and ultimately be able to spot those warning signs and handle competitive conversations early on, so that you're not just talking to them after they've churned and understanding why, you're actually preventing that churn in the first place. So I like this quote, when you expand your awareness, seemingly random events will be seen to fit into a larger purpose. Obviously, this is about self-awareness as a whole, but self-awareness plays such a key role in competitive intelligence. I think about self-awareness and market awareness as really key to retaining your customers in a competitive market, because you need to understand who you are, what you offer, and what that means in the context of your market. What are the other solutions on the market? How do you differ, and how and why do you best serve your customer base? So it's through this awareness that you're going to understand your own strengths and weaknesses. And there are a lot of resources that you can turn to get this perspective. So I want to walk through a few of those examples. So all of these examples are publicly available data that, if you either have a platform that collects it for you, or you want to do some manual research, there's just so much great insight that you can get even from looking at these public sources. So product reviews, it's a great way to get some feedback from actual customers about your own solutions and your competitors' solutions. So trying to understand what is it that customers like and don't like about your competitors' solutions. How does that compare to your own? You're going to ultimately use this to leverage your strengths against your competitors' weaknesses. So trying to catalog this and understand, all right, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses based on customer feedback. Product releases. So, understanding what's new with competitors' products, where are they going, what have they recently released? Because you need to be aware of what is fresh and new among the competitor offerings, and then start to formulate your messaging around how you promote your value versus these recent releases, right? Presumably you are also releasing new products, or perhaps the competitors' products become more competitive with one of your product lines. Understanding that and preparing for that conversation as soon as those releases are made can really increase your preparation. And then culture and team insights. I find that to some degree this gets overlooked, but is a really great source of intelligence. So for example, team changes or executive leadership changes, this can be a great signal to understand where the company's going, understand the company's direction. You can get insight into shakeups in the competition if they've removed a particular founder and CEO in this example. Or you might be able to see that they've hired a particular leader with a experience in maybe a different market, and maybe that signals that they're going to be moving into that market. But that can provide a lot of great high-level strategic direction. Employee reviews, also great feedback on kind of the inner workings of an organization. So you can find a lot more, you can surface a lot more of the internal issues that are happening, or perhaps weaknesses and opportunities for you to dig into a competitor's gaps, right? They're not going to talk about their customer service team being unhappy and dealing with a lot of customer issues, but knowing that is a great signal that A, there are a lot of customer issues, and B, there's kind of a morale problem on that team. So that becomes a great kind of weapon for you in your competitive intelligence efforts. And ultimately, you want to be that company that customers love working with, because customers like doing business with companies that they like. So of course, monitoring your own presence in all of these areas is key to understand what the perception is of that relationship. So how to use this in client conversations is kind of an interesting point, where you might not want to specifically call out that, oh, so-and-so's competitor, so-and-so companies, fired their CEO, but you can start to, knowing what the weaknesses are among your competitors allows you to shift the dialogue to focus on where you excel, right? Competitor might have some instability in a particular area. Well, that's a great opportunity, if it's a differentiator for you, to promote that differentiator. And it should resonate, especially in contrast to what's going on with a competitor. And then customer updates. So case studies or even industry pages on a competitor's website, the logos that they're promoting. You can get a lot of great insight in terms of what their ideal customer is and which segments and use cases where they really focus. And so, of course, you want to contrast that with your own, what is the ideal customer for them versus your own. Perhaps it's different, and that becomes a differentiator. Where do they excel? Where do they struggle? If you see that there are a lot of case studies or logos being added and removed from their site, it shows that there's perhaps a lot of turnover or a lot of movement, customers coming and going. Perhaps there's some turmoil there. And then ultimately you want to find whatever sort of trends. Are there a lot of customers that are leaving your competitors? Are the competitors focused on specific industries? And how does that compare to where you focus? Because again, you can, if you have a customer in an industry where they don't specialize, that can be a great tool for you to help retain and show that you're committed to the specific customer needs. All right, so then how do we use all of this to boost upgrades and renewals? That's what's bringing in the revenue or maintaining that revenue. That's what we care about most. And so when you think about going into these renewal conversations and the upgrade conversations, the most successful ones are those that are prepared for, right? You need to go in knowing, anticipating customer questions and knowing your strengths and weaknesses. And so you think about what's required in each of these conversations, each renewal conversation. You certainly need to know your strengths. You need to know where you really excel and how that aligns with the customer's needs. You need to know their timing. What's their budget? What are their growth plans? Where do they want to go when, and why. And then understanding the customer needs, of course, is kind of central to all of this. And so aligning each of these pieces can make you have a very successful renewal conversation. And I'd say those first and third, the strengths and the needs in particular should be your advantages, because you know yourself, you know your own strengths, and you should know your customer better than any of your competitors, right? So you've been working with them, you have a relationship with them, they've been using your solutions. You should have a deep understanding of your customer needs. And so going into these conversations, those should be your advantages, your leg up against anyone else. All right. Final piece here is all about integrating all of this analysis back into the business. So a couple of pieces to make this work the best. So to ultimately drive impact with your churn analysis, you need to get that analysis in the right hands. So you need to share out a lot of the great feedback that you've collected, both quantitative and qualitative. So that includes certainly the quantitative trends, going back to that quantitative churn analysis. What are you seeing over time? How does that break out by different segments? What are the key reasons? And what are the trends that we're seeing? What are those internal comparisons? How we stack up against competitors? What are those strengths and weaknesses look like? What are perhaps risks that we need to address? Individual transcripts. So there's so much great feedback that comes through those churn interviews, and it can be tempting to share just the aggregate findings, which are great to share as well. That's on the list too. But the individual transcripts can provide so much color, and honestly can be so much more memorable and impactful than sharing just the data, because a lot of people across the team will likely remember stories a lot better than remember a chart. And so sharing those transcripts, you'd be surprised by how people just gobble that up, because they're so hungry for that type of feedback, and there's so much more depth to that type of feedback than they're used to getting. Like I said, you definitely also want to include the aggregate findings, trying to make sense of all of the individual transcripts. And then ultimately the key trends and action items. What are we seeing across all of these different analyses? And then what are we going to do about it? What should we do? Because a lot of those action items, they span far beyond the competitive intelligence team. And so we need to get all of the relevant teams, sales, marketing, product, service, executive leadership, all of them need to understand what's happening and what do you need us to do about it? And then why are you sharing all of this, right? So part of it is to facilitate discussion. It's not just about, here's what I need you to do. It's to have a discussion, especially about some of the more open-ended strategic conversations where you're seeing a particular issue and it's not an answer that you alone can come up with. You need to get that buy-in. You need to have that brainstorm with the key leaders in the organization. So, having meetings to share out these trends and actually facilitate those discussions can be really powerful. Of course, we're trying to build awareness, especially when you think about identifying those strengths and weaknesses. You need to make sure that everyone in the organization is aware of those, because again, you think about actually making use of all of this intelligence in the renewal conversation. Certainly customer success, account management needs to know about, needs to have all that context of your solutions and the competitive solutions. And so building that awareness and will help them be armed for those conversations, but then also help the company solve for some of the gaps. And then ultimately you want to address those challenges, right? What we want to do is establish that action plan, address those risks and challenges head on, because they're not going to disappear on their own. And so having a conversation about all of this with the stakeholders across the business can help, actually drive change. And then how? I mean, I touched on a little bit of this already, but meetings can be pretty powerful. I know it's hard to get people in a room with all these competing schedules, but meetings can be very powerful for discussions like this. You can also lead workshops or trainings to dig into some of these areas and make sure that everyone is internalizing the feedback that we're and the trends that we're seeing. Business reviews. So if you get together on, say, a quarterly basis to do QBRs, that might be a good opportunity to share some of the churn analysis and the competitive shifts. That's just a kind of a good checkpoint and also helps you kind of check in on progress to date. Internal reports, of course, a lot of this will be best consumed offline just to really take it in and sit and read what has come through. But then also combining that with real-time access, right? So it's not just about getting together on a quarterly basis to dig into all of this, really making sure that the competitive intelligence that you're finding is getting into the hands of all of the relevant consumers is key to be able to make changes on the fly. So it's not you're waiting until the end of the quarter and you've already missed out on a lot of opportunities. It's getting intel into every employee's hands that is relevant to this conversation. Getting it in their hands in real time will let them act in real time as well. And then in terms of working with each of these departments, because churn touches every team, competitive intelligence touches every team, and so making sure that this is driving the right action across the business. I think about this flow of ultimately driving action items for every team. So you're starting with that competitive intelligence that you're discovering, then you're bringing that say to meetings or trainings, but also that real-time access online to make sure that all of those stakeholders can dive in and access it whenever they need. And then ultimately driving those takeaways for every team. What were the sales issues you discovered? What were the product and services issues? Because say for sales, maybe the best opportunity that you have to avoid churn is to prevent bad sales to begin with. Prevent bad expectations, prevent bad fits, doing those trainings on, who's that best fit, how do you best set expectations, what are the use cases that we really solve for services, improving that to retain customers and deliver the expected value, sharing back what those customer experiences were and what customers value can help them replicate that with all future customers. And then, of course, enhancing the product based on the feedback that you're seeing about the product itself, both your own, and then how it compares in the marketplace. And then finally, it's time to close the loop, right? So if you're, getting this great intelligence in the right hands, hopefully you are having that impact, and you want to have that positive impact on the business. So to make sure that you're doing that, you do want to close the loop, and that. There are a couple of ways that you can do that. So one, of course, is the quantitative churn trends. Hopefully we see that go down and down and down over time, especially if we see that a large number of our churns are turning due to a particular sales issue. Well, we can even look at the trend just around churn from that issue over time, if that is the thing that we're focused on tackling. For the qualitative churn themes, this can be an interesting way to see, again, if you're having an effect with regards to tackling specific themes. So if you analyze your churns from the last month or quarter and the top, they're the top 3 reasons, actually looking quarter over quarter, what are those top 3 reasons? Are the top reasons from the previous quarter lower down the list? Are we losing fewer customers as a result of that issue? So that can help you get insight and visibility into, hey, are we making progress on the issue that we said we wanted to change? And then the status of action items, right? There are probably a bunch of action items that come out of this analysis, out of this intelligence. There are XYZ things we want to do. Just even making sure that we're following through on that and checking in with all the different players that are playing a role in driving that home. So ultimately, what we're trying to understand are, are we making progress on the metrics that matter most to the business? Are we having a real positive impact with our churn analysis and our competitive intelligence? With that, let's just summarize and dig into questions after that. Firstly, how to use competitive intelligence to retain more customers includes these key steps. Analyzing churn quantitatively over time so that you can set your internal benchmarks and monitor those trends. Using churn interviews to get more of the qualitative side, surfacing those underlying issues and sharing out the feedback to all the relevant teams. Understanding your competitors in terms of their products, their company, their customers through your normal CIO efforts, but with the lens of, hey, how are we best serving customers? How can we best continue to retain and upsell our customers? And then getting proactive about churn by using CI ahead of renewal and upgrade conversations, not waiting until after the churn happens to try to fix issues. It's about preventing those issues in the first place. And then knowing your strengths and weaknesses versus your competitors, that's what you need to get a successful renewal. And making sure that you're training all of your internal teams on those differences is key to make sure that every customer conversation goes in with that knowledge. And then finally, sharing trends and sharing intelligence across the team to ultimately drive positive change in all of those different areas, because this churn and retention is a reflection of every team pitching in and playing their role. And so you want to drive that positive change across the business, and then make sure that it actually drives the results that you're hoping to see. So measure those results, close that loop, and hopefully you should see some positive impact there. With that, thanks so much. Glad that everyone could join the webinar, and now would love to dive into any questions.
Ellie, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting and a very comprehensive webinar. Folks, I am going to open it up for questions. I do have one. Hang on one second. Okay. Here it is. So we are in the position where we did not conduct a churn, and now we are trying to renew. Is there any hope for us?
I mean, there's always some hope, certainly. I mean, it's
she's
never
laughing.
Cool.
She's like, I know.
I mean, that's bound to happen, and I think it's great to be aware that you want to do this. And to some degree, I think the pain of a churn can help motivate the company to invest in this in the future. So I think there is hope for you, of course. I find that, you think back to the questions that you go through in a churn interview, and a lot of it goes into, all right, what was the journey that led you to the churn, right? It's no exact one thing. I mean, I guess if there's one disastrous moment, perhaps there's only one incident, but usually there's a series of events. And so trying to understand, and I think that what happens through those series of events is that the company ignores it. And so even the act of trying to learn from the customer, like what happened, like help me understand, what are your goals? Like maybe you've gotten disconnected from their customer needs. Like help me understand what your needs are, how we fell short, acknowledging the mistakes that you made, I think can go a long way with trying to rebuild that relationship before they, ultimately churn. Yeah, so I think, there's still time. I think that you still want to go through a lot of the same conversations with the hope of either saving them or at least getting them back in the future. I will say I have worked at a lot of businesses where the customers who have been churn risks but then saved often ultimately end up churning anyway later on. Because I think there's a deeper issue. So I think as long as you can get to that deeper issue, like what is the need that we are not solving for? Maybe the use case is off, or maybe you need to commit to making the changes that you're promising to the customer. If you're willing to do that, if you're willing to hear the customer, if you're willing to make changes, I think that there's definitely opportunity to save them.
She says thank you, and she'll let you know. Um, I do have a question. Somebody is asking what the link to the report was that you
Oh,
mentioned
yes, it's
initially.
crayon.co/wave for Forester Wave.
Is it /wave or /wave? Because it's not
Backslash.
/wave. Okay.
Mhm.
Um,
Also, if you go to our blog, which is crayon.co/blog, then it's noted in the first article, most recent article.
Great. She says thank you. I don't have any other questions at the moment. If you folks happen to think of one along the lines and it comes to you an hour from now, feel free to either send it to me and I will forward it to Ellie, or send it directly to Ellie, and I'm sure she would be happy to share her thoughts on it. Ellie, I would like to thank you so much for this presentation. It was really fascinating. And thank you all so much for attending.
Great, thanks everyone.
Have a great day.